Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Indie Alaska is an innovative weekly web series capturing the diverse and colorful lifestyle of Alaskans. Real stories of everyday Alaskans at work and play. Supported in part by Alyeska Pipeline Service Company.
The National Weather Service.
Good Tuesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 24th of February. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your latest weather information for your community and village, whether that's through NOAA Weather Radio, Marine VHF, weather.gov, or arh.noaa.gov for the Alaska weather. Weather info lines open at 800-472-0391. You can find us all day long on Facebook, Twitter, and on YouTube. If you search for AKwx TV after this show, you can find the complete broadcast of what you're watching right now from our broadcast partner here at alaskapublic.org. Tonight's hazardous weather includes a lot of snow for most areas around the Kotzebue Sound region and the Seward Peninsula and the Chukchi Seacoast and the Bering Strait communities. Let's start up north first for the winter weather advisories. Those are expected to expire around 6 o'clock tonight. You're looking at winds producing some poor visibility at times, but conditions should be improving as we go in through the rest of the evening. Maybe an additional light amount of snow, but most of the issues that you've experienced today should subside as we go into the evening hours. So improvements noted on the northern coastline. As we get a little bit further south, though, you see the orange shaded areas. Those are winter storm watches, places that we're not entirely sure are going to get some worsening winter weather that is moving up from the south and west. The question is exactly how far inland is that going to develop? And what we do know is that there is warm and wet air surging northward on a southwesterly flow coming across the Bering Strait. And some of that could reach as far east as places like Ambler and into the interior of the Seward Peninsula. If that happens, you're going to see some sizable amounts of accumulating snow that could take you well through the rest of the weekend into the early part of the weekend. The conditions, though, that are shaping up a little bit to your west of that, though, are a little bit more certain, and because of that, winter storm warnings have been posted from Point Hope southward to some areas along the west parts of the Brooks Range and the south-facing slopes there, and also around the western tip of the Seward Peninsula, including Shishmaref, just to about Nome, does not include Nome at this point, Tin City, and also around the St. Lawrence Island and the Bering Strait seacoast. For these areas, we're expecting as much as 12 inches of snow, and that could take you into starting from about Wednesday morning and lasting until about 9 o'clock on Friday morning. So a little bit more certain that during that time you could pick up a good foot of snow. On top of that, southwest winds are going to gust to about 40 miles per hour. That could produce some local blizzard conditions, but probably not widespread across the entire area. That's why it's not a blizzard warning yet. That could change. But right now it looks like a winter storm warning is in effect starting Wednesday morning and lasting all the way through 9 o'clock on Friday morning. For the areas shaded in red here, it includes the Chukchi Seacoast, areas around the Kotzebue Sound region from Shishmaref, the westward tip of the Seward Peninsula, and around St. Lawrence Island there. Other areas shaded in orange are under a winter storm watch for those conditions to possibly develop in your area, maybe even worsen. Some places that could be worse, again, would be around the Kobuk and Noatak Valley regions, where you could see anywhere from 1 to 2 feet of snow. So certainly worsening conditions are possible. You're going to see some snow. The question is how much, and will it be that bad across the Kobuk and Noatak valleys as well as the Seward Peninsula. So watch for more information as we go ahead in time. Certainly tomorrow we will have several other more rounds of information for the weather computer models that will help us determine if snow is going to pile up in some of those areas. But conditions will worsen as we get into the rest of the week and early parts of the next weekend, and watch for accumulating snow. Now, with that in mind and what we're watching up here across northwestern parts of Alaska, this is what's doing it. This is that surge of moisture we were talking about yesterday on that strong southwesterly fetch working into the central and northern parts of the Bering. You can see the circulation here west of the chain, and as that continues to travel northward, it will push that very warm and wet air over cold ground and over the mountains and into all the right places that could probably use a little more snow. In fact, we hear the dogs are heading toward Nome at some point here in the next couple of weeks. So that will be a timely snow event for you. The question is, how much do you get all at once, right? So winter is going to surge in from the south and from the west. Around the rest of Alaska, southeast is catching a little bit of a break, not nearly as wet as it was for the last couple days there across most parts of the panhandle. Still some puffs of clouds passing through from time to time, and a decent circulation just to your west and southwest. As that continues tracking northward, a frontal boundary will likely push more rainfall your way toward the end of the week. Also across south central, most of the precipitation chances will just be right along coastal areas or maybe even just south of that. Grazing Kodiak Island and southwestern Alaska from time to time, and we'll see scattered areas of snow showers develop across the interior. But by and large, the bigger weather maker for most of Alaska will be the surge of southwesterly and warm weather moving in across the Bering and heading for north and western sections of Alaska toward the end of the week. Here's a look at the weather map right now. You can see the storm out in the west at 982 millibars, the circulation across the Gulf at 997 millibars, a high pressure ridge across southeastern Alaska, some pockets of snow around Valdez today, some of that coming down in big chunks, and also areas north of the Yukon around Ambler and westward toward Bettles and Kotzebue Sound region, looking at some light snow as well as even some freezing rain possibly up around that region earlier today. Light snow across the Beaufort Seacoast with a frontal boundary park there. As we get into tonight, that begins to lift northward a little bit more as that southwesterly flow kicks in a little bit stronger. High pressure is trying to set up across the lower Yukon Valley at 1,034 millibars there. That will help to clear the sky across many parts of west and southwestern Alaska. Low pressure continues to sit and spin across the western Gulf. That really doesn't change very much, but you start to see the moisture sneaking a little bit closer to the southeastern coastline and also around Prince William Sound. Right now, again, most of that looks like it hovers very close to the coastal areas, if not just offshore. Across the west, low pressure moves northward just a little bit more closer to the Gulf of Anadyr. With that colder air surging in from the west, we'll start to see a better opportunity for some stronger winds around the western chain, also just west of St. Matthew Island waters. Watch for that in the marine forecast. What I'll show you in the forecast coming up in the marine section are the winds that are west of the island there, so keep that in mind as we go ahead in time. Snowfall likely starts up around St. Lawrence Island and for the Kotzebue Sound region, as well as the south-facing slopes of the western Brooks Range. By Wednesday, you can see that warmer air is still working northward. Still have some pretty strong upslope flow coming into the western parts of the mountains there. So any flying that you need to do around the northern sections of Kotzebue Sound or even the interior of Seward Peninsula, those conditions are going to be changing rapidly. So watch for that to take shape even starting late tonight and early tomorrow morning. High pressure sitting very close to Fort Yukon will continue to really clamp down on the cloud cover across the Copper River Basin. This is sitting in the Matanuska valleys as well as southwestern Alaska and areas around the eastern Beaufort Seacoast. Again, we'll start to pick up the wind a little bit more as we get into Wednesday afternoon. The front wrapping through southeastern Alaska will finally fizzle out. We'll keep a trough of low pressure sitting across southeast. With high pressure in charge, you'll likely get a northern breeze back across the Lynn Canal and areas in the Cross Sound region, but the better chance of rainfall will occur for central and southern sections of southeast. High pressure across southwestern Alaska and Kodiak Island will stay intact, that at around 1,035 millibars, but that works with a conveyor belt coming in from low pressure in the west to bring up that southwesterly fetch and focus that on the mountains in the windward side of the Seward Peninsula and Norton Sound. Watch for some pockets of heavy snow there. Again, winter storm watches posted for areas around Nome in the interior of the Seward Peninsula, and we're watching for the Kobuk and Noatak Valley regions for the potential of heavier snowfall there. I've gone ahead and drawn that in. The conditions look pretty good, but the National Weather Service office in Fairbanks, again, will be monitoring the changes there and refine that forecast. So we could see that change from a winter weather advisory or a winter storm warning, or perhaps nothing at all if conditions track this snow a little bit further to the west and you take those regions out of harm's way. So once again, we're watching for some heavier snow in the north and west as low pressure is tracking to the west of the Bering Strait. We're also watching colder air trying to drop southward a little bit more into the Beaufort Seacoast. that we could see some areas of light snow develop there, but probably the wind will be a little bit of a greater issue there with time as we get into Thursday and Friday. Temperatures today back in the mid-40s for southeast. South Central saw readings in the upper 30s around Cook Inlet to the lower 40s as you get down to Homer and Seward. Prince William Sound was back in the 30s today. Up to Susitna Valley, 20s and 30s there, mostly lower 30s, in fact, north of Talkeetna. And Healy also looking at 35, Fort Greeley 32, 30 in Fairbanks and 31. Around Eagle, 29 in Northway, 28 for Fort Yukon, 19 in AKwx Pass. Single digits and teens for most areas in the Arctic coast. When you got up to Kaktovik, it was 25. 21 around Wainwright today, 20s and 30s for the Kotzebue Sound region, 21 in Nome. Unalakleet was 25, McGrath showed 33. 30s for areas around Grayling and Sparivon, 31 in Bethel, 25 in St. Lawrence Island and Savunga. Crystal Bay saw temps back in the mid to upper 30s. Looked like Dillingham was showing 32 by late afternoon. Lower 40s for Kodiak Island on either end. 30s and 40s for the Alaska Peninsula from Point Hayden to Cape Sarachev, Sand Point and False Pass, and even Cold Bay, looking at temperatures that really weren't too bad. Mid 30s around St. Paul and St. George, 39 for Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, and 38 for Shemya today. Low temperatures tonight will hover above the 0-degree mark for most in the interior, with a few exceptions around Tanana, up toward Bettles at 2 below. Most areas, though, in the west are warming up with that southwest wind. Look at those lows, only in the lower to mid-teens. Bethel at 14, 20s for Bristol Bay, 30s for some areas in the peninsula, 38 in Kodiak, south central teens and 20s there. And southeast looking at overnight lows in the upper 20s and lower 30s, 2 below for Barrow with a high of 15 tomorrow. Wednesday looks like 24 for Bethel, 27 in Nome. Kotzebue Sound looking at temperatures in the upper 20s tomorrow. 30s and 40s for the Alaska Peninsula, 37 in St. Paul, and 30s and 40s for the central Aleutians. Low to mid 40s for southeast. South central also hovering just above freezing, 42 in Kodiak. On to flying weather now. Look for IFR conditions to develop across some parts of the southern sections of southeast into the Dixon entrance region. Look for IFR conditions also across the northern parts of the Alcan border, heading just east of Fort Yukon and around the Beaufort Seacoast. Patchy MVFR conditions are expected, but look for a little broader area of IFR conditions, mainly offshore the Chukchi Seacoast, and MVFR should be fairly widespread across most of the central and western Bering Sea. And AKwx Pass, expect MVFR. Same goes for Adigan Pass tomorrow. Some conditions may improve out to the east, but it looks like most areas in the north will see marginal restrictions. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass look okay. Rainy Pass and Windy Pass are mostly going to be VFR, but we expect a little bit of MVFR for Windy Pass in some of the northern regions as we start out our day, but improvements should be seen for Isabel Pass as well as we go. Mentasta Pass, we expect improvements throughout the day toward VFR conditions. Tanita Pass, we'll call visual flight rule at this point all day long. Portage Pass looks to be pretty nice there with high pressure setting in. And Chilkoot and White Pass, we expect that to lean over toward MVFR conditions as the day goes on. Here's freezing levels, and warm air is still hovering across the central and eastern Gulf. The surface freezing line taking a notable rise northward towards St. Lawrence Island and St. Matthew Island as that southwesterly flow is kicking in at the surface. You can see that reflected in the icing potential as well. Light to isolated moderate, generally above 2 to about 4,000 feet with the higher levels down south, of course. And we'll watch for some icing potential to develop inside of Norton Sound, generally east of Stebbins and then into perhaps the lower Yukon Valley there. That also around 2 to about 3,000 feet. For southeast, some areas that could reach occasional moderate tomorrow from Sitka southward toward Haida Gwaii above 8,000 feet and above 4,000 feet, wrapping around low pressure here across the Gulf of Alaska. That's above 4,000 feet just south of Kodiak Island. As you look at the jet stream and we kind of pull out the view here from Alaska a little bit, you can see that powerful jet that's lined up now coming in from the south and from the west. And underneath that, that warm and wet air and those surface low pressure systems that are tracking from southwest to northeast have a clear shot at northwestern Alaska. So here comes the Pacific moisture over the Bering Sea, and everything's lining up just right to really wring out some snow, especially for some of those more western areas like the western tip of the Seward Peninsula and St. Lawrence Island, and perhaps even some areas across Norton Sound. At 9,000 feet, we see 30 to 40 knot winds pretty much from the south and west. Clear shot here. Now, the winds slow down significantly as you get north of the Alaska Range down to about 15 knots, and a weak area of high pressure is trying to push itself northward in toward Shelikof Strait. Winds are also coming in from the south and west across central sections of southeastern Alaska thanks to a little blip in the flow here. Low pressure is developed in the lee of the Chugach Range. At 3,000 feet, the flow's not quite as tight, 30 to 40 knots or so, though still coming in from the south and west. Low pressure's got a little bit of a bigger grasp on the Gulf of Alaska in this case, and northeasterly winds coming down through the Chugach Range and over Cook Inlet at 20 knots, and a southerly flow a little bit more in force there for parts of southeastern Alaska. 20 to 30 knots are expected. Tomorrow's turbulence, that broad area along the frontal boundary and that southwesterly flow. We're still looking at most areas that have enough wind speed there to kind of shake the yoke for you a little bit. The central Aleutians below 3,000 feet, occasional widespread moderate there, but probably a much greater issue of running into some chop across the Brooks Range and points north in the lee of the Brooks Range there below 5,000 feet, and probably around Kotzebue Sound. Anywhere in the vicinity of the gaps and the passes that you like to fly through and some of the rougher terrain, you're probably going to start running into more and more turbulence as we go through the remainder of the week. That's a look at your aviation forecast. I'll be back in just a few minutes with the rest of your marine weather. Stay tuned. Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and joining me once again is Eric Stevens from GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska, based up at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Eric, welcome back to the program.
Hey, I'm glad to be here.
And once again, you brought some wonderful satellite pictures to show us and do a little show and tell about. It's just amazing. I can get lost in satellite pictures all day. What did you bring today?
Right. Well, weather satellites, what are they good for? Yeah. Of course, there's the pretty pictures that they bring us. You know, we've got a picture here from April of 2012. Okay. The Sumi NPP satellite, it's what they call a polar orbiter, which means it covers Alaska because we're near the pole. Beautiful image. You can see a storm off of southeast Alaska, the sea ice along the Bering Sea up into the Arctic. A really nice picture, and this is important because it allows a forecaster to see where the storms are, where the ice is, where the clear areas are. You need to know where the weather is now if you're going to forecast it into the future. Exactly. So satellites give us these good pictures. This is called surveillance of the weather. And you know, that same satellite also has another picture from a little more recently, August of 2014, Tropical Storm Iselle bearing down on the Hawaiian Islands. Okay. Hawaii doesn't get hit by a whole lot of tropical storms or hurricanes. Sometimes it does. And here's a picture from the same satellite, the Sumi NPP Polar Orbiter. It shows Tropical Storm Iselle approaching the Hawaiian Islands from the southeast. You can see the storm swirling away there, and then there's the Hawaiian Islands. This is a tropical storm, not quite as strong as a hurricane because we don't see the eye wall in there. This is still a serious weather system. And all of this information comes just from that satellite picture. It's so much information, and it's wonderful to look at. You see the beauty and the awe of nature right there depicted in that weather satellite. We call it a polar orbiter because the satellite flies high over the globe. Maybe we could look here at we happen to bring the planet Earth with us. This is our satellite. A polar orbit flies really close to the Earth, maybe 800 kilometers over the Earth, and goes up over the pole and then back down, and then the Earth spins under the satellite as it goes by. That's in contrast to the geostationary birds, which are much further out. And they don't view Alaska quite as well. So we love those polar orbiter satellites here in Alaska.
So when we're a lot closer, we get much better details and imagery and an idea of a better maybe position of what's going on when it's passing right over Alaska or right over Hawaii.
Yes, exactly right. The polar orbiter gives such a good view of places like Alaska. And because it's close to the planet, there's another aspect of satellites in the polar orbit that is helpful for weather forecasting. It's an aspect that's maybe not as immediately obvious as the pretty pictures that we see. And that is the capacity for the satellite to produce what's called a sounding. That is finding the vertical profile of temperature and moisture in the atmosphere. We've all heard of weather balloons. Weather balloons are launched here in Alaska twice a day at a number of airports, everywhere from Barrow to St. Paul Island to Kodiak, Anchorage and Fairbanks, Yakutat, a number of places. Launch these balloons, and we've got a picture of a balloon being launched at an airport, and the balloon goes up. It's pulling a little package, an instrument package with it that reports temperature, pressure, humidity data back, and we use that information to help feed what are called numerical weather prediction models.
The models.
The models, right. It's a mouthful, so we just call it the models. And these computer simulations, these models are computer programs that simulate the motion of the atmosphere. Well, how does a model know what the future will be like? You have to tell the model what things are like now. And you give it all kinds of information, including information from these satellite sounders. Very important. Just how important are they? We have a recent, comparatively recent study that really brings home, and this is Superstorm Sandy.
Right.
We have a track image here of the track of Hurricane Sandy. It was down in the Caribbean around Cuba, and then it moved north over the ocean offshore of the eastern seaboard, and then at the last minute, Sandy made what's called the left hook. It turned hard to the left and slammed into New Jersey. Was a major problem for the mid-Atlantic states, a calamity. It fused with another weather system and became known, this is not an official title, but Superstorm Sandy.
Right.
It was quite the weather event. Well, the modelers, after the event, there's a group of modelers in Europe. They have a very good model, a frustratingly good model if you're the Americans trying to pursue their excellence. They reran their model afterwards in what's called a data denial study, where they kept everything the same. So this is 6 months after Sandy, but they went back, they reran the same model, they fed the model the same initial conditions, that is telling the model, okay, here's where we think Sandy is, down near Cuba in the Caribbean. Everything was the same as it was in the real forecast, except they didn't let the model know.
No satellite data.
No satellite data. So we're going to put that over here, no satellite data for you. The resulting forecast 5 days out, back when the real Sandy was happening and the model had the satellite data, the forecast was pretty good. We've got a graphic here on the left side. We show the forecast of where Sandy would be, and that's the red bullseye on the left. It's just south of where it actually wound up hitting. Not a bad forecast from this computer simulation, 120 hours out. On the right, you see the same model, but it didn't have the satellite data to help it understand things. And the storm is way offshore. It misses. The forecast is more accurate when the model has the satellite data. So that's the idea today we want to convey, is weather satellites. They're important because they show us the pictures of where storms are. We see good examples of this. Yeah, the surveillance right now, it's great to look at those pictures. And in addition, behind the scenes, maybe not immediately obvious, but the models have to have that satellite data for them to be good forecasts. And then a meteorologist uses that information to help everyone with the forecast of where the storms will be in the future.
That is fascinating information that we can look at, see where things have been, because you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. That's that old adage there. But seeing that satellites are actually helping us move forward in the weather information system is pretty amazing stuff.
You bet.
And if you want to check out Eric's satellite images that he's been talking about, whether that's something from today or last week or even much further back in Alaska history, you can easily do that yourself. Go to www.gina.alaska.edu and you can find those images there. Eric, thanks so much for joining us once again. And again, we will join you hopefully again soon for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts, where you'll tell us more really cool information about the satellites over our heads in Alaska. Thanks for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next time. Change that coat and tie faster than Superman. Can you believe it? Here's a look at the sea ice edge, and across Bristol Bay and north of St. Paul, you can see the ice edge is lifting a little bit further and further northward. In fact, a lot of this here in Bristol Bay is actually open water, just some strips of ice there floating around with some slightly higher concentrations than actually the open water, but you get the drift. A lot of this is drifting northward there thanks to that southwesterly fetch at this point. More on that in just a minute. In southeast, look for northerlies across the Lynn Canal and through the central intercoastal areas, southeasterlies across Clarence Strait, and 20 to 25 knots up the outer coastline with 9-foot seas in most areas for Wednesday. By Thursday, we get a northerly push coming down the coast again, 15 to as high as 25 knots just outside of Cross Sound. Northeasterlies blowing offshore from Craig and Klawock. In the intercoastal waters, 20 knots there around Clarence Strait from the south and east, 4-foot seas. And remember, we said the northerly winds were going to come up there across the Lynn Canal. There they are, 35-knot winds with 7-foot seas on Thursday. For South Central, watch for a northerly flow coming down Cook Inlet, 15 to 25 knots higher in Shelikof Strait with a 7-foot sea. North and northeasterly winds across the Western Gulf and Prince William Sound, still looking at 15 knots there with a 2-foot sea. Compare that to a northeasterly flow east of Kodiak Island, 35 knots with a 14-foot sea. For Thursday, a little bit of a shift there. The winds kind of deadened a little bit in the northern Cook Inlet and inside Prince William Sound as low as 10 knots, maybe even lower. 2-foot seas there inside of Prince William Sound, 5-foot seas west of the Barrens. That northwesterly flow starting to feed back into low pressure as that shifts a little bit more to the east toward the Panhandle. Look for northwesterly flow outside of Prince William Sound and more of a westerly flow as you move out of Resurrection Bay. 15 knots there in most of the Western Gulf. 7-foot seas are expected. For the Alaska Peninsula, a northerly flow, fairly light across Bristol Bay. It should get better. 3-foot seas there on Wednesday, northeasterlies down the coast, northerlies on the Pacific side, 30 knots with an 11 to 14-foot sea by Thursday. A southeasterly return flow, 1-foot sea, almost flat there again with a nearly open water. Southerly flow there north of Cold Bay, and a very weak, if not southerly flow, 10 to 15 knots on the Pacific side with a 6-foot sea blowing into the peninsula. For the Aleutians, generally a southerly flow. The winds will remain around 40 knots there. Still a gale, 18 to 19-foot seas there from Kiska to Attu. A weak variable flow with a 7-foot sea south of Unalaska and Nikolsky, and as we get into Thursday, the flow remains from the south in most areas in the central and eastern chain. A southwesterly shift there in the west, 20 to 25 knots and 25 to about 35 knots for the central and eastern chain. For the west, broad southerly flow as you would expect. Remember, the strongest winds west of St. Matthew up to 40 knots there, a little bit less to the eastern side of the island, 30 to 40 knots in most areas, 25 knots in the Pribilofs, come up to 30 on Thursday with a southwesterly shift around the St. Matthew Island waters and southerlies up the western coast to St. Lawrence Island. Again, 25 to as high as 35 knots for Thursday. And for the Arctic coast, a south and westerly flow in just about all areas. A little bit more of a westerly shift there around Kaktovik, 25 knots. So not only will you get snow across some of the western coastline, but you'll likely get some wind that, again, could gust up to about 40 miles an hour in some places. That will likely reduce the visibility when that is happening, especially on top of snow. 30 to about 35 knots in many areas there for Thursday. We'll see that around 30 knots northwest of Point Lay and north of Prudhoe Bay, again with 25 knots northwest of Point Barrow. Here's a look at tonight's forecast. Again, we're watching the weather develop across the western Bering Sea as this warm and wet air surges northward on a pretty tight southwesterly flow coming into northwestern Alaska. Winter storm watches are posted for some areas around the Kobuk and Noatak valleys starting tomorrow and lasting into perhaps as long as Saturday morning. Could see 1 to 2 feet in that area. For the interior of the Seward Peninsula, perhaps up to 12 inches, and just to the south of that, a winter storm watch for Nome could include that much snow. Many areas around the Chukchi Sea coast and the Bering Strait coast are looking at a winter storm warning at this point, and you are expected to see around 12 inches of snow. The bigger factor on top of that additional snowfall that could come in the next 2 to 3 days will be the blowing wind. Up to 40-mile-an-hour gusts are possible. They're reducing visibility, making travel a little bit more tricky. Be careful up there. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather. See you again tomorrow.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Cook Inlet Tug and Barge is a marine transportation company specializing in harbor services with a primary marketing focus on the Port of Anchorage, providing their customers with quality-based service specifically tailored to their needs.
The National Weather Service.